I welcome you all on this pious occasion of the 6th MR Yardi Memorial Lecture. The late Madhukar Rao Ramrao Yardi was chairman of our executive board. He has authored for us books on the Mahabharata and Yoga, which are among our bestsellers. In the recent past, Mr. Anand Yardi and Yardi family at large have contributed a great deal of digitization and automation of our library. We have set a goal to place on our e-library 25,000 rare books and important books. Of these, 8,200 plus books are already available on the e-library named www.borylib.com. We wish to name this e-library after the late MR Yardi as and when it is allowed by the Yardi family. With this introduction, I welcome you all again and hand over the bias for the further proceedings. Thank you.
Mr. Arjun Rao, please.
Thank you, Srinand. My name is Arjun Rao. I'd like to share just a few words about our grandfather, MR Yardi. I was fortunate to spend time with Mota Baba, as we called him, but not nearly as much time as is possible in today's digital world. My children get to speak with our parents many times a week. My siblings, cousins, and I would have loved to have had that time with our grandfather. But despite that, his impact on our lives is enormous, not just because of the opportunities given to my mother and her siblings, but possibly even more so because of the principles he instilled in our family. One of the principles that stands out was his unwavering integrity, always acting with honesty and clarity of purpose, even in the face of pressure or inconvenience or financial sacrifice. Another key principle was a life of public service and avoidance of materialistic pleasures. And especially as his career progressed, he could have accumulated many luxuries, but instead he focused on living a simple life and engaging in pursuits that he found challenging and rewarding. And finally, scholarship, instilling in us that one of the true joys of life is to continue to learn and apply oneself throughout our life, no matter what age or how successful in prior careers. The example he set after retiring of studying and translating works like the Gita, and as Bori's own Dr. Bhandarkar wrote, he was a discerning student and a conscientious practitioner of the teachings of the Gita. These principles our grandfather passed on are deeply felt in our family. His children and their spouses are living lives aligned with those principles, and our generation is doing our best to live up to his example as well. Hopefully that is one of his enduring legacies. Thank you for attending this lecture, and with that, I'll hand it over to my brother Akshay to introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Arjun, and thank you all for joining. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Subhash Kak, Regents Professor of the Computer Science Department at Oklahoma State University in Stillwater, Oklahoma. Born in Srinagar, Kashmir, India, Dr. Kak was educated in various places in Jammu and Kashmir. He completed his PhD in electrical engineering from the Indian Institute of Technology in Delhi. From 1975 to 1976, he was a visiting faculty member at Imperial College in London and a guest researcher at Bell Labs. From 1979 through 2007, he was with Louisiana State University, where he served as a Donald C. and Elaine T. DeLune Distinguished Professor of Electrical and Computer Engineering. While at LSU and Oklahoma State, Dr. Kak has worked in the areas of artificial intelligence, data security, neural networks, information technology, and quantum information processing. And as a personal note, both Arjun and I graduated in our degrees in electrical and computer engineering from the University of Texas. So this is a special introduction for us as well. And like my grandfather, MR Yardi, Dr. Kak also has expertise in a variety of areas, including being an expert in Indic studies and a Vedic scholar. My grandfather was a statistician and economist by training, but also excelled in similar areas by applying these methods to Indic studies. We are fortunate to have similar extensive expertise and contributions in diverse areas with Dr. Kak and through his speech today. In 2008 and 2009, Dr. Kak was appointed one of the principal editors for the ICOMOS project of UNESCO for the identification of World Heritage Sites. He is the author of 12 books, which include The Wishing Tree, Presence and Promise of India, and In Search of the Cradle of Civilization, New Light on Ancient India. And in 2019, Dr. Kak received the very prestigious Padma Shri Award, recognizing his contributions in the field of engineering. Nearly 50,000 nominations were received for the 2019 Padma Awards, and 112 awards were made, out of which 4, which included Dr. Kak, were in the area of science and engineering. His many awards include British Council Fellow, National Fellow of the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, Distinguished Alumnus of IIT Delhi, and Science Academy Medal of the Indian National Science Academy. Please note that we will leave 10 minutes for a live Q&A session as discussed earlier. At the end of this talk, please leave your questions in the chat box and I will select and read some of the questions during the Q&A session with Dr. Kak. Once again, thank you for joining. I'll turn over to Dr. Kak's speech titled Science, Consciousness, and the Idea of India.
Namaskar to everybody. First of all, I'm very grateful to the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute that has invited me to speak at this year's MR Yardi Memorial Lecture. The topic of my lecture is Science, Consciousness, and the Idea of India. And what I'm going to do is to sketch the changes in our understanding of the evolution of science in India, and use that to address some very fundamental questions which have led to certain notions or self-awareness about what India is, and which have had a tremendous influence on Indian policy making and polity in the last 60 or 70 years. So let me begin with a quote by the great Sri Lankan and English Indologist, historian of art and religion, Ananda Swami, who about 80 years ago wrote this, and I quote, "Although the ancient and modern scriptures and practices of Hinduism have been examined by European scholars for more than a century, it would be hardly an exaggeration to say that a faithful account of Hinduism might well be given in the form of a categorical denial of most of the statements that have been made about it, alike by European scholars and by Indians trained in our modern skeptical and evolutionary modes of thought." Now, this is a very, very big statement, because what it's saying is that after 150 years of research, and this is, of course, 80 years ago, what is being said about Hinduism, at least in the views of Ananda Swami, is incorrect. Now, where this statement stands right now is that many scholars who have followed him sort of dismissed this altogether. And independent India, this was before India became independent, independent India decided to go along with the paradigm that had been developed by European scholars and their Indian followers, in the words of Kumaraswamy, which more recently is being challenged as a colonialist view based on European gaze, so to speak, which viewed India as a people or as a place to be controlled. So more about domination and not necessarily of looking at the facts as they were, which in my view, if you look at scholarship of the past many decades, it's generally been the historians of art who have gotten the understanding right, at least to my mind. And another person whose name comes to mind is Heinrich Zimmer. And people who have depended more on just texts have generally got it wrong. Certainly, you go back all the way to Max Muller or Keith and many, many others who have followed them. And their view has been colored by what Kumaraswamy called skeptical and evolutionary modes of thought. And what that might mean is something that I will put focus on from a different perspective, and that is the perspective of science. Now, let me begin this perspective from a personal point of view. Many years ago, almost 35, 40 years ago, when I was doing research in AI, I realized that a lot of the effort that had gone into representation of grammars by linguists and by computer scientists had, in a certain sense, been anticipated by Panini in his great grammar Ashtadhyayi. And many scholars, like Fritz Stahl and many others, have argued that Panini anticipated the very nature of computer programming and the idea of a program of representation, which allows you to generate all kinds of sentences if you follow those nearly 4,000 rules. And it has not only rules, it also has rules about rules, which is what you have in a grammar. Now, what intrigued me at that point was that when I was reading histories of Indian science, it was being stated that there was no writing at the time of Panini, and in fact, the mathematics that we know, geometry, as in the Shulba Sutras, and astronomy was in the standard view being traced to ideas that were taken from the Babylonians or the Mesopotamians and the Greeks. So the question arose, how did such a sophisticated system as Panini's, when Panini was not even supposed to be knowledgeable about writing, could have arisen in a vacuum, unless you're a kind of a creationist who believe that everything comes suddenly, so to speak, because all of scientific advances are a process. And of course, Panini speaks of grammarians before him. And therefore, what I did was to look back various layers of literature, Sanskrit literature, going from the various shastras related to various sciences, the darshanas, and then the Aranyakas, the sutras, the darshanas, the Aranyakas, the Upanishads, and of course the Brahman and the Samhitas itself. And while doing this, I discovered a structure to the very organization of the Rig Veda. I also discovered that the great Agni Chayan ritual of the Vedic times had a astronomy that was associated with it, and this astronomy was fitted very well into the kind of rites that were performed, because this astronomy was related to the movement of the sun and the moon, of which we already have evidence in the Vedanga Jyotish. So we came to that indeed it was not that the Vedanga Jyotish thing, which even though it has an internal chronological marker of say 1300 BCE, but Western Indologists kept on insisting that no, this came after the Mesopotamians. So this sort of opened up many different questions in the very evolution of scientific ideas, and it appeared that the standard view was not correct, and we needed to look back into how the development of ideas took place. Now, furthermore, to make a long story short, in all these studies, I also went back to the Kanada's Vaisheshika Sutras, and I translated them for the first time, if you will, from the perspective of a physicist. And what one discovers there are the laws of motion. Two of the three laws, Newton's laws of motion, are already there, and there is also a very sophisticated system related to how objects move unless they are interfered with, and also the idea of the observer, which is of course a part of all the Indian darshanas and all the other shastras, is a part of that physics, so that what one really requires then is to take another look at the development of the ideas that have taken place in India. Now, apart from this, now somebody might say that, okay, these are ultimately, minor changes, so to speak, of our understanding. All right, let's grant that there was also some physics, and certainly there was logic and yoga, as we all know, and other Vedangas and so on. But does that change our larger picture? And that's where, when we do a examination of the main transformative ideas that have occurred within India or in the world in the last 5-6 centuries, the scientific revolution is traced to the invention of calculus and infinite series, and traced to Leibniz and Newton, late 1600s and 1700s. But now we know, historians of science know, and accepted by everybody, that more than 200 years prior to that, in the so-called Kerala School of Mathematics and Astronomy, both infinite series and calculus, the rudimentary calculus, had been developed. And prior to that, of course, there are beginnings of calculus in Bhaskara's mathematics, which goes back to the 12th century. And prior to that, of course, we have the mathematics of Brahmagupta and Aryabhat. So we do have a whole sequence of evolution of ideas that lead us to the big leap that apparently occurred in Kerala and led to the development of infinite series and calculus. Now, of course, there are some historians who argue that the Jesuits were present in South India at that time, and the argument has been made that perhaps the Jesuits, who were interested in Indian knowledge systems, took these ideas back to Europe, and it took some time for these ideas to diffuse through Europe and ultimately in the flowering that we all know in the time of Newton and Leibniz. Now, we see something similar about 600-700 years prior to these events. Fibonacci and his translation of Indian mathematics and the Indian number system, which was to make a revolutionary change in the way science was done in Europe. And what's interesting here is that Europe fought, or European scholars and the scientific elite fought the Indian number system for about a couple of 100 years. They fought them because of the negative numbers and so on. And so it does take some time, even for the most obvious advances, to be accepted in a cultural area, and certainly in the cultural area of Europe. That was about 1100 CE. And then the argument that I've already mentioned, that is that perhaps the Kerala School of Mathematics and Astronomy ideas were taken. But even if they were not taken, and let's assume that the Europeans, Leibniz and Newton, invented calculus and infinite series on their own, but this does make us pause and reconsider the whole question of development of more recent science, because there is, of course, contestation related to ancient science, and that contestation is partly also because the Eurocentric view that all the great scientific advances took place in Europe. So as far as science is concerned, Europe is the source. Eurocentric scholars are prepared to concede that perhaps some rudimentary philosophy, because that's how the put down would be used for it occurred in China and India, but not science. Science goes back to Greece and in certain things to Mesopotamia. So now let's look at a few other scientific, modern scientific advances that have changed the world. Apart from calculus, another one that comes to mind is mathematical logic. And mathematical logic is the basis of logic gates, which are a part of computing circuits. So you could not have computers without mathematical logic and logic gates. Now, the development of mathematical logic goes back to 1850s or so in the UK, and it's traced to three British mathematicians, Charles Babbage, Augustus de Morgan, and George Boole. And so, in fact, Charles Babbage even tried to create a mechanical computer. So, in fact, sometimes Babbage is credited as the creator of a programmable computer, not a electronic, but a mechanical computer. Now, so they published this work, and it became extremely influential all over the world. But George Boole, I think he died in the 1860s. He died young, and in the 1890s, George Boole's wife, Mary Boole, who was a science writer in her own right, she wrote a very influential essay where she traced the development of mathematical logic to the mentorship by George Everest. George Everest is the guy after whom Mount Everest is named. He had been Surveyor General of India for many, many years. And he used to, from time to time, go back to London. And he had a salon. And these three originators of mathematical logic belonged to his salon, where he would talk about what he had learned in India. So according to Mary Boole, what George Everest had done was to have brought Navya Nyaya, which modern scholarship accepts is equivalent to mathematical logic. And Navya Nyaya, the development of Nyaya, which took place in Bihar and Bengal about 1,000 years ago. So what Everest, according to Mary Boole, had done was to say that, look, this is how logic can be made more context dependent, and this is how it's being done in Navya Nyaya. And these trio came up with this symbolic notation for all those operations, which now, of course, are a part of modern science. So this great advance has Indian antecedents, and according to linguists, modern linguists, and logicians, mathematical logic, modern mathematical logic is exactly equivalent to Navya Nyaya. So this is very interesting, because the question once again would be, then is the colonial view of India as a land of religion and ritual, and not as a land of science, is wrong. Without going into too many details, I just want to mention two more Indic ideas which have had influence indirectly. One is the periodic table, and as we know, in chemistry, all the elements are written in a periodic table, and it's called the Mendeleev's periodic table. Now, a lot of people don't know that Mendeleev was influenced by Sanskrit Varnamala to create this table. And in fact, when he first proposed it, he gave 4 or 5 as yet undiscovered elements Sanskrit names. And those names have, of course, been superseded. And then also inoculation. When the British came to India, they discovered that these Vadyas would farm out every year in a certain season and inoculate the general population with previous year's smallpox pustules. And according to the doctor who wrote about it, this system of inoculation did not fail even 1 in a million. And in fact, I've quoted this in one encyclopedia of non-Western science. It's well known. There's just no dispute about it, because it was published prior to the development of inoculation or vaccination later on. But then this history had been forgotten for a long time. I must also speak of quantum mechanics itself, the deepest science that there is, on which all of modern sciences are based, is quantum mechanics. Without quantum mechanics, you cannot explain chemistry. Without chemistry, you cannot explain. Without quantum mechanics, you cannot explain physics and chemistry. Without chemistry, you cannot explain biology. Without biology, you cannot explain brains or brain structure and, of course, complexity and so on. Now, one of the two creators of quantum mechanics, Erwin Schrödinger, who's an Austrian, but he was also a Vedantin. In his autobiography, which he wrote in the 1950s, he says that when in the 1920s physics had reached a kind of a dead end, they couldn't explain why the electrons which go around the nucleus as we know is positively charged, the electrons are revolving around it and they are negatively charged. Why don't the electrons fall into the nucleus? This was one of those big problems. And it's for this solution of this problem that quantum mechanics was first invented. And then, of course, it's been seen to have applications to all kinds of areas, to physics, to superconductivity, to chemistry, to solar science, and so on. Now, Schrödinger in the 1950s, in his autobiography, said that the central idea of quantum mechanics came to him from the Upanishads. Since Schrödinger was a Vedantin, and he had read the Upanishads and the Gita and so on, he would always travel with them. So he says that the Upanishadic Mahavakya, I am Atma Brahma, that this Atman is the entire cosmos, gave him the central idea of quantum mechanics is that the single state is a superposition of all possibilities. There are two central ideas. As a quantum theorist, I can tell you this. Two central ideas of quantum mechanics. One is the idea of superposition, which Schrödinger claimed came to him. Doesn't mean that it's a part of Indian science, but at least in terms of analogy, this came to him from the Upanishads. The other idea of quantum mechanics is that when you interact with a quantum state, then only one of the superposed states becomes accessible to you. And what this takes you to amazing parallels with central Vedantic notions. And these notions were recognized by not just only Schrödinger, but also Heisenberg, the other creator of quantum mechanics, and the entire quantum mechanical community has claimed that there is a complete consistency in the interpretation. This is the standard, the orthodox Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics and Vedanta. And what you obtain is through your interaction, because there is this divide between the subject and the object. This is a divide which is described way back in the Vedas or in the Upanishads, in the Mundak Upanishad, for example, this statement about two kinds of knowledge, para and apara. The apara is which is accessible to language, where rules describe all its evolution, and para, where you're speaking of the knowledge obtained by the subject, by the individual, by consciousness. So there is in quantum mechanics a divide. In the orthodox interpretation of quantum mechanics, there's a divide between the observer and the observed, just as there is a divide between the self and the embodiments of the self, or between the Purush and the Prakriti. Prakriti is governed by Rit, by laws, while Purush is free. And this freedom is also a part of the perception of understanding of how things evolve in quantum mechanics. Now, my good friend and a great Indian physicist who died last year, or more than a year ago, just more than a year ago, George Sudarshan, who was from Kerala, who's also a Vedantin. In the 1970s, he, along with his student, he wrote a paper where he argued that one can, by observation alone, transform the quantum state of an object. Because the question that arises, and this is a question which goes back also to Leibniz, that if you have two worlds, the world of thought and the world of objects, how do these two worlds interact? And likewise, where does the interface between Purush and Prakriti take place? This is even described in the Vaisheshika Sutras, where you have, first of all, the idea that you have that everything that you see in the world is to be seen as karma, as motion, but there's also an interaction, and that interaction between the subject and the objects is at the samavaya. And how does that interaction take place is, of course, a very interesting question. From the limited scope of the observer and the observed in quantum mechanics, George Sudarshan argued that by observation alone, you can do this, and the process of observation does not require any expenditure of energy. Now, this is something that he called the quantum Zeno effect. And the quantum Zeno effect has been demonstrated in the lab. And not only can you freeze the natural evolution of a physical system by continual observation, but you can also steer it to the outcome that you desire. Now, this is a question which in Vedanta itself has been a part of debate for a long time. And the resolution that was provided, because the whole question was, if there is a writ, if everything is governed by laws, then how does the deity, how does Purush intervene in the evolution of the world system? And the resolution that appeared many centuries ago is called Drishti Srishti Vada, that through Drishti, Purush can do Srishti, can create Srishti, which is perfectly analogous to this process of quantum Zeno effect. So the question then that arises, if one goes back, is how do we understand the idea of India? India, in its own understanding, is a civilization of knowledge and science. It's a Veda itself means knowledge. It's a civilization of knowledge, and the charam, the extreme endpoint of this process of knowledge, of course, is Atmavidya, which is knowledge of self. Now, it so happens that modern science has also, after the developments in so many different fields, such as computer science, neuroscience, biology, physics, has come to the point where it is accepted that consciousness is the ultimate scientific mystery, because there is general understanding of all of these fields, excepting perhaps cosmology, and I'll also come to that in a minute. So the mystery, first of all, is not everybody, although a vast majority of physicists accept the orthodox Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, but there have been some attempts to come up with interpretations where the observer, the actions of the observer itself are a consequence of the interactions or evolution of quantum mechanical system, and they have not been successful. These attempts have not been successful. So the question then is, where does, if you have the universe is composed of physical objects in motion, which is something that Vaisheshika Sutras also acknowledge, that everything about the physical universe must be seen in terms of motion. Then where does consciousness come in? Now, of course, in the Indian system, consciousness is fundamental, and it's through consciousness that the physical universe is embodied. And there is another sort of side story to this. I think it was in 1896 or 1898. Vivekananda was in New York, his third or fourth trip to America, and he was invited by the most famous actress of her times, the French woman Sarah Bernhardt, to a party where she had also invited Nikola Tesla, who was extremely famous at that time because he was the inventor of the alternating current motor, and AC power had been adopted by Westinghouse. So he had sort of defeated Thomas Edison, who was the other famous inventor who was pushing for DC, direct current distribution of energy. So Nikola Tesla's dream was to ultimately transmit energy wirelessly. So he was very interested in how energy could be created in huge volumes so that it could be sent through the atmosphere. And he devoted the last many decades of his life to this dream. So when Tesla and Vivekananda met, and we have recordings of this meeting, both in the diary of Nikola Tesla, which has been published, and in the letters that Vivekananda wrote to others. And apparently, Vivekananda told Tesla that, look, according to Indian physics, and he obviously was talking about Vaisheshika, and he was also talking about descriptions, for example, in the Mahabharata, or the descriptions in Yoga Vasishta, and many other texts. He says it is possible for mass to be converted to energy. And we see this, for example, in the idea of pralaya, as sketched in the Mahabharata, that ultimately a sun becomes larger and larger, then the planets fall into it, and ultimately, matter becomes, Prithvi becomes Apas, and Apaha becomes Tejas, and Vayu, and then Akasha. These are the five Mahabhutas. So there's this transition, and we don't quite know where or what Vivekananda was quoting, but he apparently did tell Tesla that energy and mass are interconvertible, and he in his letter he said that, look, if you are able to show it, wouldn't it be wonderful? It'll also take you closer to your dream, and it'll also establish Indian physics in a fashion which would be accessible to everybody. Now, we do know that Tesla was unable to do it, and 7 or 9 years after that, Einstein wrote his E = mc square paper. But there are at least one American historian of science who's argued that Tesla was the most famous Serbian scientist of his times, and Einstein's first wife, she was a Serbian. And in fact, some of you might know that the main relativity paper that Einstein submitted originally had both his and his wife's name as co-authors, and it's only when he got the proofs that he dropped his wife's name. And so some people have argued that this idea that E and mass should be interconvertible may have been communicated via Einstein's wife by Tesla. And we also do know, as a side story, that when Einstein and his wife were divorced, Einstein promised to give the prize, the Nobel Prize money, should he win the Nobel Prize, to his wife, even though they would have been divorced for a long time. And ultimately sort of reneged on it, and he gave her only half the prize. So there are all these connections. To come back to the thread that I was on, the ultimate mystery in physics is, where does consciousness come in? If there is a divide between consciousness and the embodied world, how are the two related? In computer science, and this is a very urgent problem of our times, can computers become conscious? In fact, there are some computer scientists and mathematicians who believe computers will become conscious as computers are able to embody or model more and more modules of the brain at some point where the complexity of these connections exceeds a certain level. Suddenly it'll become conscious. Personally, I think that argument is totally flawed, and I've written both scientific papers as well as for the general media on this, that this will never happen. But still, the problem remains. Why isn't the silicon computer conscious or silicon machine conscious when the brain machine is conscious? So where does consciousness come in from? Likewise, in neuroscience, one of the puzzles is that with fMRI, functional MRI, and other imaging, no single neural correlate of consciousness has been found. So where does consciousness reside? And it could not reside in a certain neuron or in certain clump of neurons, because what would be the experience that is associated with consciousness? How would this translate into some electrical activity in those clump of neurons? And so that experience will always be beyond any fluctuations in voltages or currents in the neural circuits. Now, you also have a pressing problem, and this is something that I've worked on recently, in cosmology itself. Cosmology has hit some kind of a big crisis. And the crisis is because the galaxies and the stars and galaxies which are away from the centers are moving at speeds which are totally unwarranted, either by Newton's gravitation theory or Einstein's gravitation theory. And then more recently, about 20 odd years ago, it was discovered that the expansion of the universe, which has been known for some time, this expansion is actually accelerating. And for the large speeds, which cannot be explained from the known distribution of matter in the universe, for that, people have postulated dark matter. For the accelerating expansion of the universe, what's been postulated is dark energy. But now what's funny is that 96% of the universe is supposed to be dark matter and dark energy. Another 3.5% is supposed to be interstellar gas, which makes it 99.5%. So the observable universe is only 0.5%. So in other words, there's a huge crisis. We cannot explain it because there is not the slightest shred of evidence for either dark matter and dark energy in the labs. So what might give? And I think the ideas related to the constitution of mind and consciousness might play a central role. Recently, I published a whole series of papers arguing that space is not three-dimensional. Its dimensionality is slightly less than 3. It's actually e-dimensional. If space is e-dimensional, then we are able to solve a big modern cosmological crisis, which is that the rate of expansion that we get from two different ways of measurement are very different from each other right now. And these two ways of measurement is to look at either the cosmic microwave radiation or to look at how the various stars are moving, because you can isolate them at different times, at different distances, and that would depend upon their times, and they turn out to be different. But if you do accept that the universe is e-dimensional, then you're able to resolve it. In fact, you might want to look it up. I published it in Nature Scientific Reports some time ago. And in fact, this is something to do with information. And a lot of modern physics is about entropy, and entropy is average information. And average information requires minds, and that requires consciousness. So in my view, a slightly different perspective would possibly open up the universe to explaining these unresolved puzzles that exist, for which, as I mentioned, dark matter and dark energy have been proposed, and for which there is no evidence at all. And just as 120 years ago, Einstein himself got into physics talking about the observer in relativity, and he brought in the observer, and entropy was brought in through thermodynamics, and that's been so central to the growth of science in the 20th century, perhaps to do it at a deeper level. And to do that at a deeper level would perhaps require going back to the Indian sciences, because, as I mentioned, there is extraordinarily deep thinking that has gone into these constructs. Just let me give you another example to bring in something else. We do know Sri Vidya, for example. Sri Vidya is a representation of the inner cosmos and the outer cosmos. And within the Sri Vidya, all those triangles, which represent 43 of those, 9, 3 and 3, 6, 9 triangles, which make 43 smaller places, but within which at the center is the Bindu, who represents Shiva. And what it really means is that Shiva, the more you look for it, all that you can find is Shakti, or physical embodiment. And the more Shiva, you cannot turn your gaze. And as in the Mundaka Upanishad, Apara Vidya and Para Vidya. Apara Vidya are all the Vidyas that are accessible to observation and recording. And the moment you record it, the moment you observe it, it is accessible to language. But Para, the science of the observing self, is beyond language, and therefore Para, just as in the Bhartrihari's description as well of the 4 modes of language, Vaikhari, the descriptive, Madhyama, Pashyanti, where we see the structure, intuition, which corresponds to our intuition, and then finally Paravak, which is beyond language. So to tie up all these threads to the idea of India. The idea of India, which unfortunately the Free India adopted, which was the colonial view on the foundation of racism, which saw India in that anthropological terms, without acknowledging the very great depth of intuition in the Indian view, because all the knowledge that exists in consciousness. So you can approach science either descriptively, which is very important, of course, we don't dismiss that, but also through consciousness itself. And these are like 2 wings, and you need both these wings. And possibly what happened in India, if we were to try to understand why India seemed to have faltered in recent years, although that's really not true, because here, 500-600 years ago, we also have continuing development in math and astronomy in Kerala, for example. Or prior to that, there was continuing development of Navya Nyaya itself. And then India also became a great place of continual strife and war. But look at India's own self-definition, which is different from the Western, the colonial definition of India as a land of no science, of ritual religiosity, and which is why I totally concur with Ananda Kumara Swami that the descriptions of Indian religion itself are incorrect, are wrong. They're correct at a superficial descriptive level. Western scholars did wonderful lexical work. They created data and so on, and they made these translations, but they miss the deeper meaning. Half truths, or if you're talking about superficial structure. Now, of course, superficial structure is also important for a person to be able to stand up, the foundational structure. But if that is imposed on an entire people as all that there is, which is what the colonial view of India has done to India, and India has adopted it, and which is why India became separated and alienated from the true wisdom of its own civilization and culture, which is why Indians have followed in recent years the Fort George model of development, which is okay. The West, tell us what can we do. We'll do your back office, or here scientific leaders tell us we can do. You tell us this paradigm, and we're going to do some further work, and we'll do great work at the second tier and subsequent tiers, and which is why in the 1990s also, when India tried to break open at least and stand up on its own in electronics and computers itself, they decided to go only for back office. In contrast, East Asian countries who were more self-confident said that we're going to develop our own products. And now Asian countries have overtaken India. Now, I believe all this is changing. We are getting more Atmavishwas. First of all, you have to approach the Indian knowledge system on its own terms, which has not been done. And I know it, as a student, for example, also of Kashmir Shaivism and so on, I see a lot of the scholarship more on, hey, what sect had access to what. It's all descriptive, more about power and not about the heart of the subject. And I think that's what's required. And I think we must approach India for what it claims to be. And if it falls short, then we should speak the truth, because after all, it's India. The idea of India is the idea of truth. What we are looking for is Sat, not Asat. Sat, reality as it is. And reality as it is it's not sectarian. We are not looking at it as something which has been used to put it down. Even at that Vedas are ritual. Vedas are what the Brahmins do. That's all totally wrong, in my view. There is, of course, sacred theater, but all of that was theater for each person, as the Shatapatha Brahmana, for example, says that, the ultimate yajna is within oneself. So we need to go to all these texts and discover the deeper layer that there is, so that in addition to the outer surface structure, we also get to know the deeper structure. Now, Indian text also has traps for everybody. You can get stuck, and these are traps, for example, which Patanjali speaks about in the Siddhis, that you can get stuck at the Siddhis, where Siddhis can be viewed as levels of understanding. If knowledge is a staircase through the underbrush, so that ultimately you go over the foliage and become free and are able to soar in the sky. So in the under foliage, you can get stuck at so many different levels. And people within India also can get stuck. It's not all human beings are the same. There's no distinction in the starting point, because I know a lot of wonderful, great Western scholars who get it, and a lot of Indian scholars don't get it, because a lot of Indian scholars, their own minds are colonized. This colonization that began 200 years ago, we have been marinated in this for so long that a lot of the scholars, as Ananda Kumara Swami called them, the followers of the Western Indological view, have gotten stuck in this. So I think the time has come to throw off this yoke, so to speak, and address these scholars, these texts, in all the humility and with directness and with commitment to truth, and call out what is superficial and wrong or not central, and what is central. Now, the great in the living tradition, people, the rishis, the tradition of rishis, which continues to this day, get it all. So it's for us to gather together and take it beyond where we stand. And I think India stands at a very crucial point. There is a huge crisis in the West because of AI and because of the cult of the body. The West had its own spiritual tradition, but in the last 40, 50 years, that's been sort of abandoned. And the cult of the body is leading to disasters such as, the addictions of various kinds. Young people, by the time they're 20s, they think life has no meaning, full of despair. Last year, 90,000 young Americans, in the prime of their lives, 20s and 30s, died of opioid overdose. Jobs are going to shrink because machines will replace humans in more and more places. So the ultimate frontier that there is the inner cosmos. And that's where India has so much to teach. But these texts will not reveal all those secrets unless we go looking for them. Because we can, as I mentioned before, can get stuck in the various traps that there are and believe that this is all there is, or believe that ritual is all that we need. All of that were ways to take a person to a higher ground. In fact, there's a dialogue in the Bhagavatam between Narad and Yudhishthir. Yudhishthir goes to Narad and he says, what is a shishta? What is a person to do in one's life? And Narad tells him that a person should study all the shastras that there are to study, which is sciences and disciplines, until one approaches that point of paradox or paroksha. Because you push every tradition, whether that's a modern tradition or Indian Shastric tradition, to its ultimate, and you reach a paroksha. And that paroksha, if the moment you recognize that, that is the yajna that takes you to the higher ground. Because what yajna is sacrifice. It is sacrifice. It's the killing of who you were. Because what you're killing is the mind, because the Atman, of course, is forever eternal. But it's our mind. We are all stuck in the different disguises, so to speak, of the mind. And so all of knowledge then is to go through these transformations of the mind so that one is ultimately able to break free and obtain that samadhi or that point where Shiva and Shakti meet. Because ultimately, Shivoham, each one of us is Shiva, but we are alienated from our own self. So all of this comes together. But rather than just do the darshanas and the Indian philosophy by itself, stuck in the debates, for example, in the work of Utpal Deva or Abhinav Gupta in Kashmir Shaivism, debates with the Buddhists whether mind is continuous or whether it's all transitory, transitory transitions from one to another, that there is no mind, or there is Shiva which holds everything together. Rather than just do that, and that's extremely valuable, we need to take India from its provincialization by the West, and put it in a corner and take its center stage. That's what the West itself is looking for. And I can tell you, as someone who's traveled a lot in the West and interacted with some of the leading scholars in various fields, in the West, they are looking for it too. And India can provide that leadership. And I hope this conversation today will inspire or encourage people who already are aware of many elements of the Vedic tradition and its amplification in the various commentaries, etc., but have been too scared to go out and take it beyond the frameworks in which these have been discussed. I think what's required now is to take all those ideas and developments and apply them to the central problems of science and philosophy and culture and civilization at this point. These are universal problems, so that ultimately we are not talking about just Indian culture, so that India itself is the world. India is not geographically the subcontinent that we are talking about, because we are talking of universal questions. We are talking about universal questions of meaning and the mystery of reality. Thank you very much.
Dr. Kak, are you okay if we move to the live Q&A? We have quite a few questions.
Of course, yes.
Okay, yes, and good to speak with you. So I will start with the first question. Do we need some official documentation or recognition of these Indian discoveries, laws, and ancient scientific frameworks and ideas of consciousness in the world of modern science and mathematics? And if so, how do we get that recognition and documentation?
Oh, these things have all been published in peer-reviewed journals, and they are accepted by the world of scholarship. So this is not something which is out in the fringe, some people pushing things which don't even are true. This is all accepted universally by scholars. All that I mentioned is a part of the scholarly conversations that have been going on for the past many decades. So there's not one item that I mentioned. In fact, I left out many other interesting tidbits, which can also be of interest to the layperson, right? Because after all, as you know, all of knowledge is storytelling of one kind or the other. Even scientific knowledge, ultimately, you have your mathematical equations and you put them together as a larger narrative. This is how the world evolved, or this is how nanomaterials work, etc. So you have many different kinds of stories. And what is certainly required is for retelling of these stories in new ways for the layperson. Because how do you get them interested, or to find, how do you find the hooks so that you can have somebody investigate all this stuff on their own? Because as that famous slogan, trust but verify. So you've heard a story, then you should go back to the sources and check the story out for yourself. Does it hang together? So in other words, it's not that it's not part of the scholarly knowledge which consists right now. It is all that I mentioned is accepted by scholars across the world.
Excellent. The next question is, And somewhat similarly, then how and when can Bori and related international organizations give the due recognition to scholars from India when all of the European researchers have mentioned their study is based or inspired from Vedanta? It seems that there has been immeasurable loss and or theft of the Vedic knowledge of India due to these invasions.
I don't like the phrase theft of Vedic knowledge. All knowledge is universal. What is different, if you want to go to the very foundations, what is different from the Vedic view of reality to classical Western view of reality? The classical Western view of reality, everything is only matter. The Vedic view of reality says, yeah, it is matter plus consciousness. Now, of course, there are also streams or substreams, they're not the dominant streams in the West, who have also argued for, well, how can you explain freedom, for example, if everything is material? Because materiality could not be free. But in India, this has been the mainstream view, that you have consciousness and then you have matter. In the West, the view has been, okay, we have matter, and then somehow consciousness arises out of matter, which is okay, which is a good scientific position to begin with, but then it cannot explain how people have freedom. Because if consciousness emerges out of matter, there would be that emergent system would still be governed by its rules, and therefore there cannot be true freedom. And this is something that scientists are grappling with even now. And in fact, one of the views is that we are really zombies, and consciousness arises after all the random processes within your brain have led you from one point to another in your life, or in your actions in a sequence of time moments. But then you have a sense that you are free, but in reality, you're not free, and every human being is a zombie. And big books have been written on that. And okay, that's a intellectual perspective, and one can sort of look at it and see whether it is satisfactory, whether it does conform to all the evidence there is, or how do you explain somebody like Srinivasa Ramanujan coming up with all these formulas, and when asked, well, there is no math for it, and he would say, well, I saw them in my dream, or the goddess Namagiri gave them to me in my dream, and I don't know where I got them from. And according to most creative people, and people have done research like Jacques Hadamard and others, most creative people would say that the discoveries come to them in a kind of an altered state, or they're dreaming, or they're under a lot of stress, and it's not inductive. It's not just based on rational thought. Discoveries in all kinds of fields, including creative thought in the arts, or even as a business person, you can be creative. They come from somewhere. And that indicates that this idea that the mind is only a consequence of random fluctuations inside the brain with some structure could not be true. And therefore, from that perspective, yes, the Vedic perspective has something to offer which the standard Western view does not. And the greatest scientists and creative writers and artists have been inspired by that. So I would not say that they have stolen it, because this is also universal in the West as well. Thinking people or sensitive people realize that, or even a poet like Emily Dickinson would realize, or have realized, that there is something more than just our bodies.
That actually answers, I think, the next question, which was, would it be fair to say that ancient Indian philosophers speculated on the nature of reality and came to conclusions that have great parallels in modern thought? Western scientists, with their quantitative methods, took these concepts and developed scientific formulae, et cetera, that led to practical applications.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, Heinrich Zimmer, the great German historian of Indian art, starts his book, one of his books on Indian art, saying that, what perplexes the Western reader is to imagine how come on the banks of the Ganges, he says Ganges, of course, that these rishis thought of these problems to which the Westerner has come now. And it both perplexes the individual and also sort of confuses. I'm paraphrasing. This is not the exact words that he said. And that is indeed true. But then on the other hand, to be fair, somebody like me, I read Marcus Aurelius, who was the Roman emperor, I think 3rd century CE. And I'm amazed that his mind, I can almost feel exactly like how he felt, how he wrote about reality as he saw it. Of course, he was a king, he was a man of action. So that humans all over in all societies, thoughtful humans, free humans, have seen the world in ways which are very similar. Now, of course, what's unique about India is that the rishis came up with a logical structure. They made this distinction between, for example, the para and the apara. Para, which is transcendent knowledge, and apara, which is standard knowledge. And that distinction and all the modes of analysis that we have in the darshanas, for example, this amazing stuff in Vaisheshik Sutras, which talks about the nature of physical reality, where there are certain aspects, because Kannada, in his Vaisheshik Sutras, not only talks about the Mahabhutas, elements, physical elements, etc., but he also speaks about the subject, the observer, which in the Western tradition has only recently come into the scientific picture, right? You have the observer in quantum mechanics, or you have the observer in psychology, but the observer is always shifted away and it's not been integrated. And that is where the Indian view of reality can still be of relevance, or is still of relevance.
Excellent. There's another question. What was the role that Macaulay played in eliminating the teaching of any progress that Indic thinking had made in local languages?
I don't think that's what Macaulay did. What the British did in the 19th century was that until then, as Dharampal in his famous book, The Beautiful Tree, has shown, maybe 60–70% of kids from all communities, and it was not that education in the pathshalas, the mandirs, pathshalas was exclusive to only certain communities. No, from every community, because the British superintendents of education, they have data that from this jati and from this jati and from this jati, so many students studied at these. So education was fairly universal before the coming of the British. And but of course, it was limited, it was still stuck in certain things, and it had to be opened up. But now what the British did was they said all education would be only in English language. And of course, he claimed that all of Indian knowledge could be put on one shelf of a Western library. This is, of course, his statement, his assertion, without any understanding of that the whole tradition, which people like Coldbrook, Indologists and Sanskritists, argued against this. This is all nonsense. But in any event, Macaulay won. So India's own education system was dismantled, and new schools and colleges were set up. And of course, some lower education was still communicated or taught in local languages, but higher education, which to this date, higher education is done only in English. So it has separated Indians, excepting those who were Sanskritists, right? And then they were still attached, and there was the Sanskrit College, and there is of course the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute. There was a few handful or maybe a few hundred Indians doing or still connected, excepting for those who for their own sadhana were doing Sanskrit, but no formal stuff. And I think that's what has led to this sense of disempowerment, or the sense that the idea that India didn't have any science, because people were not aware of the science. Indian physicists don't know about Vaisheshik Sutras, for example. And if we all go back to Euclid or Aristotle, and even Indian physicists do, they should at least go and investigate Vaisheshik Sutras and see if it's of any value. If it's not of any value, then throw it off, right? But even that has not been done. So that is the tragedy.
There's quite a few questions. I want to be sensitive to your time, Dr. Kak, but I wanted to skip to one more question, which is, Dr. Kak, thank you for your very interesting and informative lecture. When did you get interested in studying Vedas, Shatras, and ancient India? How did you get interested in this field? And when did you develop your insights? And I graduated from IIT Delhi, not me, of course, in 1968. We may have been at IIT Delhi at the same time. It's a pleasure to meet you after 53 years on Yardi. So we'll go to that question.
Well, I was interested after my PhD. I was working on, I'm an information theorist. So I've been interested in things like cosmology and quantum mechanics for a very long time. But it was in the mid 80s, and I briefly mentioned that I was doing Panini or AI, and I got interested in Panini, and the whole story doesn't jive. How come Mr. Panini creates this sophisticated structure, which has been seen as equivalent to a computer programming language, and the whole thing as equivalent to a Turing machine? Now, you don't do it if the theory is that Panini also did not even know writing. Everything exists in a certain larger framework. And of course, Panini does talk about predecessors to him. So that's how then I started investigating different, this is the mid 80s, I got extremely interested that I should find out what is this whole mystery. How come you have Panini? And then as I investigated the Shastras, the astronomy, that's the first thing I started doing. I looked at the astronomy, and there I was astonished that here is this theory that if anything is missing in Mesopotamian and Greek geometry, and if you find it in Greek astronomy, and if you find it in Indian astronomy, then it is Mesopotamian and Greek astronomy, which the Mesopotamian and Greeks did not preserve, and it's therefore to be viewed as Mesopotamian and Greek astronomy. This is totally ridiculous. Can you believe it? That David Pingree, who was a leading historian of astronomy at that time, published a whole series of articles arguing that you can recover the lost Mesopotamian and Greek astronomy from Indian texts, because the Indians copied it because they didn't understand it. They just copied it, and they were mindlessly copying it. And all of Indian astronomy is also mindless copying of Western scholarship. And in fact, this continues to this day. Many of the Western scholars are always looking for, hey, where did this come from? Maybe it came from Indo-Greek kingdoms in Bactria. Almost anything has to be seen as coming from outside. Now, if it really did come from outside, that's fine, but it doesn't stand up. It's sort of ridiculous. So in fact, some of the most colonial, or racist is a very strong term, but sometimes one's forced to, as in BLM, people are talking about racism. This is one of those words which has come into the public domain. Some of the worst departments are the Sanskrit departments, because these professors of Sanskrit or South Asian studies, they become the gatekeepers to this knowledge system, or this view of India, and nobody's allowed to challenge it. If you challenge it, then they're going to call you all kinds of names. And but that's the way it is. That happens all the time. That's happening right now in America. You have the woke view of reality, and if you say this doesn't stand together, this is a political thing. This is a political fight right now, in so many different levels. In the West itself, West's own view of what it is. It's a parallel story.
Excellent. And I'll, in the interest of time, we'll have one last question. I think many other questions have been answered, and then I'll flip to Siddharth. And so, Dr. Kak, the last question is, when did the great scientists or rishis of ancient India disappear, and kind of what made them disappear, if they did in fact disappear?
Well, if you go back, India as a civilization which is static, which is another of those things which has been written up about by the West, is totally false. You see continual development and rebirth and transformation. And you know, for example, you have the fire ritual or the Vedis that were built. And in my own work, I showed how there was an astronomy which was at the basis of all that ritual. So then you have the darshanas, which represent, in using modern terms, yoga is psychology, or Vaisheshika is physics, or Sankhya is analysis in categories, and Vedanta is a model of reality. But there was a continual amplification of it. You also had tantras, where as a further development of psychology, people looked at how do you get back into the very nature of your own mind. And there were different ways of doing it. Perhaps there was more emphasis on one's own passages in one's own journey to self-understanding. And there were certain ways in which Indian culture came up short. One was that there were not as many narratives of things as they happened at the most basic level. For example, you don't have stories of or biographies of kings or stories of dynasties in straight language. You know, it was more flowery language, and it was sort of hidden in many different ways. So you have to, in order to reconstruct Indian history, and that's where the Westerners did a great job, and Westerners and their Indian followers did a great job in trying to reconstruct the chronology of Indian kings itself. So there were certain things where perhaps there was too much of putting things in a kind of a mythic way. But if you analyze it, as scholars have done, you find that there was continual development. I spoke about Tantra, people speak about Kashmir Shaivism, or in the South itself, you had Ramanujacharya or Madhva and many others. And there were continual debates going on within, and further explication within the Vedantic tradition itself. Or Navya Nyaya, we already mentioned that, right, which is equivalent to mathematical logic in Bihar and Bengal. So there was stuff going on. But I think in the West also, so you might say there was stuff going on, there were changes, but there was also much which was not changing, but it was the same in the West itself. The West was all, you had the Dark Ages, but then where the West took off was when the New World was discovered. And suddenly there was so much of capital that came in, gold that came in, that the kings then could invest in schools and colleges. And they needed these colleges to invent better timekeepers or clocks and so on, the ships crossing from Europe to the New World and back. So there was this unique thing that happened, this impulse that was given to education and scholarship. But as we see, the foundations, many of the ideas that were at the basis of that took place in India, or had already been a part of the Indian tradition, which is a wonderful discovery for people to be connected to that. Okay, certainly from the perspective of self-confidence for India's own self-definition, this happened there, and we can, given that Indian civilization has been a civilization of consciousness, Indian culture has been a culture which has emphasized consciousness, and consciousness is the frontier of modern science. Hey, why don't we see what within the Indian tradition of consciousness is fundamental and relevant for our times?
Thank you so much, Dr. Kak. These are wonderful questions, and I think you, in some of the questions answered, or in some of the answers, answered a few of the questions. So I think we got to pretty much everything. And so Siddharth, I think I'll flip to you, or Srinandan Chinmay if there's something else. But thank you, Dr. Kak, for answering these questions.
Thank you, Akshay.
Great. My name is Siddharth Kotwal. I'm another of MR Yardi's grandsons. And first of all, I would like to propose a vote of thanks to Dr. Kak for his fascinating and thought-provoking discussion, really on really challenging some of the established tenets of the sort of Eurocentric tenets of Western science, and really helping us think through how Indology and the Vedic tradition have really influenced some of the more significant aspects of Western science. Very fascinating, particularly I thought the aspects on AI and consciousness. And what I think is most interesting is how in tune this is with MR Yardi's own research and his own attitudes. He had a very much of a scientific, unbiased mind. He was a student of mathematics, and he really applied that mathematics in terms of really using data and using mathematics to understand the Mahabharata and the Bhagavad Gita and the Yoga of Patanjali. So it is great to see sort of how that applies to my own grandfather's work in his life. I was fortunate to spend quite a bit of time with him as a young person, as a teenager, and he instilled sort of he was very much influenced by service to community, as was mentioned, as well as really using his intellectual pursuits and his later life to establish an understanding of Indic principles and use that to contribute to society. I would also like to thank the Bhandarkar Institute for all of their great work on Indology. My grandfather spent every day there, I know, when for many years, and really benefited from their expertise and resources. Very recently, we actually visited the Bhandarkar Institute a few years ago with my own children, who are teenagers now, and it was great to see them sort of understanding the contribution of the institute, the contribution of their grandfather, and the Vedic studies, and really passing on all this information. So very much appreciate the Bhandarkar Oriental Researchers Institute contribution to Mr. MR Yardi's work, as well as for this event. And then finally, would like to very much thank the audience for their participation and for the very thoughtful questions. So thank you, everyone. And I will pass this back to Akshay or to Mr. Bhandari.
Thanks, Mr. Kotwal. Thanks, Dr. Kak, for a very insightful and interesting lecture. It is certainly a path-breaking lecture for us, because it will now be placed on our YouTube channel. And thanks also to the Yardi family, particularly Akshay and Arjun, who participated actively in this in the proceedings here. And there is one thing that I would like to also announce to the audience, that the Bhandarkar Institute has been conducting courses online from the last year, and we have conducted 2 batches of our course on 18 Parvans of the Mahabharata, and the 3rd batch is coming up from the 7th of October. That is actually Ashwina Shuddha Pratipada, the beginning of Navaratri. So on this pious occasion, I thank you all, and also wish all the best for Navaratri, Diwali, and the coming time. So season's greetings. Thank you very much. With the permission of all, I would like to declare that the session is over. Thank you.
Namaskar.
Thank you, Dr. Kak.